The sun had barely cracked over the tree line when I heard the sound again, grinding gravel, snapping twigs, and the unmistakable groan of tires rolling across land that wasn't a road. My farm. My property. My rules. And yet, every single morning, Hoa Karen acted like my land was her personal shortcut to the main street. She didn't just drive through, it was a performance. She'd speed past my barn, blast her horn at my cows, and wave like she owned the county. But that morning, as I stood on my porch gripping a mug of black coffee, I realized something unsettling. Her SUV wasn't slowing down. In fact, it was going faster. She was cutting deeper across my fields than ever before, slicing a fresh path that ripped open my soil like a wound. But this time, something was different. This time, I was done being polite. You see, this farm isn't just dirt and fences. It was my father's pride, my grandfather's legacy, and my livelihood. I poured sweat into every acre. So when Karen, Queen of the Hoa, self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood, decided my land was a convenient bypass because she didn't want to wait at the traffic light, she didn't just disrespect rules. She disrespected me. I tried talking to her. I tried warning her. I even put up signs, big ones. Her response? She laughed and told me to stop being dramatic. That's when the idea hit me. Not angry. Not reckless. Just, inevitable. My grandfather once taught me a simple truth: a person who won't respect boundaries will learn when the ground shifts under their feet. I took his words literally. Over the next 2 nights, while the crickets sang and the farmhouse lights stayed off, I dug. And dug. And dug. Not some cartoon pit, not some shallow hole, no. What I built was shaped, reinforced, disguised, engineered so perfectly that even a trained eye would miss it. A trap designed not to hurt but to teach. A lesson in consequences carved straight into the earth. By dawn, everything was ready. The top layer looked solid, smooth, and harmless. But underneath was the one thing Karen never expected: someone who finally refused to be pushed. So when I heard her SUV revving from a block away, tires screeching, music blasting, ego swelling, I stepped back behind the tractor shed and watched. She didn't slow down. She didn't look. She didn't even blink. The ground did. Karen's SUV barreled forward with the confidence of someone who had never faced a real consequence in her life. The chrome grille gleamed under the morning sun as she blasted across my pasture, kicking up dirt in a rooster tale of disrespect. I could almost hear her voice in my head, bragging to her ladies' brunch group about that stubborn farmer who still thinks property lines mean something. But today, the earth had other plans. And Karen was about to meet them head on. From my vantage point behind the tractor shed, I saw the exact moment her front tires crossed the disguised seam in the soil. The layer I'd engineered held for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the suspension to compress before it collapsed inward with a deep, resonant whump. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried, like a breath being sucked straight into the belly of the earth. Then came the drop. The SUV's nose plunged first, swallowed by the hollow beneath. The back lifted into the air almost gracefully before gravity claimed it. The entire vehicle slipped down in a single smooth motion, like a pebble sinking into a pond, except there was no water, only dust, roots, and Karen's shocked, muffled scream. The ground shook lightly under my boots, then settled. Silence followed, broken only by the distant moo of a cow who seemed mildly inconvenienced by all the commotion. I approached slowly, keeping my boots firm on the stable soil. When I reached the edge of the trap, I peered down. There, lodged at an angle in the earthen chamber, sat Karen's shiny black SUV, now coated in brown dust, headlights still glowing like confused eyes. Through the windshield, she stared up at me, hair frizzed, sunglasses crooked, mouth hanging open in a stunned oh that might have been comical if the situation weren't so richly deserved. She hit the horn. A pathetic, echoing honk. I folded my arms. "Good morning, Karen," I called down evenly. "Shortcuts closed." Her jaw moved, but her voice didn't come out right away. When it finally did, it came in gasps. You can't do this. This is illegal. This is dangerous. This is my land," I replied. "And I warned you." Her face flushed crimson. She pounded on the door like she expected it to magically free her from a hole of her own making. The irony? She wasn't trapped by my pit. She was trapped by her arrogance. I tossed a rope down not too close, just enough to remind her I wasn't trying to hurt her. "Ready to climb up," I said, "or would you prefer to stay and think for a bit?" She glared daggers. Karen's glare could have cut through steel, but down there in the pit, it didn't carry the same power it usually did at HOA meetings or neighborhood patrol drives. For the first time, she wasn't towering over anyone. For the first time, the world looked down at her. And she hated every second of it. She grabbed the rope I'd thrown down but didn't climb immediately. Instead, she shook it like she was testing its strength or maybe testing me. Her voice rose, sharp and trembling with indignation. "You're going to pay for this," she said, pointing an accusing finger upward. "My car is totaled. You hear me? Totaled. This is going straight to the HOA board. Straight." I blinked slowly. "Karen, the HOA doesn't control my farm." Her face twisted. "We have influence. You don't have jurisdiction over fence colors out here," I said dryly. "Let alone underground geometry." She sputtered, clearly searching her mind for some rule, some ordinance, some imaginary law she could whip out like a magic spell. But the pit had stripped away her usual confidence. The longer she stood down there, the more she seemed to realize reality wasn't bending for her this time. Finally, she gripped the rope again. "Fine," she snapped. "Pull me up." "That's not how ropes work," I replied. "You climb. I steady." Her jaw dropped at the thought of manual effort. "Climb? Me? I'm not climbing anything. I could break a nail." I stared at her. "Karen, you drove into a construction site disguised as a pasture. The broken nail ship sailed a long time ago." For a moment, I thought she might actually shriek. Instead, she muttered a string of words that might have been complaints, curses, prayers, or all three. Then, reluctantly, she placed her designer shoe on the first foothold and hauled herself upward. The climb took longer than necessary. She stopped to complain every 2 steps, pausing to insist the rope burned her palms, that the angle was wrong, that the walls were dusty, that I should have installed some sort of emergency ladder out of consideration. But eventually, breathless and sweating, she scrambled over the edge and collapsed onto the grass like a stranded sea creature. I let her sit for a moment. The quiet stretched between us. Finally, she lifted her head, hair matted, blouse smeared, dignity shredded. "This isn't over," she managed. "You have no idea who you're messing with." "Oh, I do," I said calmly. "Someone who'll keep doing this unless she learns something." She stood shakily. "You'll regret humiliating me." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just said, "Then maybe you should stop humiliating yourself." Her eyes narrowed. The moment Karen staggered away from the pit, I realized something important: the battle wasn't over. Sure, she'd been humbled, humiliated even, but her ego was a stubborn, unyielding thing. And now that she had a taste of consequences, I had to plan my next move carefully. I didn't want revenge, I wanted resolution. The trap had been a statement: boundaries exist. But I needed to make sure she learned the lesson fully, without escalating things to a police-level feud I didn't want. I surveyed my farm, noting the deep tracks her SUV had left across the grass and the soil that had been upturned by the collapse. The pit was now covered, the camouflage restored, leaving no sign of the chaos beneath. It was perfect. Invisible to the untrained eye. And for Karen, that meant one thing: every time she even thought about cutting across my property, she'd have to consider the unseen consequences. I poured myself a cup of coffee and walked toward the barn. The cows milled around lazily, indifferent to human dramas. One of them mooed, and I laughed sometimes. The animals seemed wiser than the people around them. At least they respected boundaries. Unlike Karen. But my thoughts drifted. The HOA was going to hear about this. And they would come snooping. I had to prepare. Notices could be faked, fences could be questioned, and my neighborly reputation could be twisted. So I decided to document everything. Photos of the pit, the SUV, her climb out, and my careful work maintaining the farmland. Documentation wasn't just evidence, it was insurance. Over the next few days, I kept a low profile. Karen's absence was notable, she hadn't driven past once. But I knew it was temporary. Her type doesn't stay defeated for long. I also noticed something interesting: other neighbors started approaching me not with complaints, but with curiosity, some even with subtle admiration. My method wasn't conventional, but it was undeniably effective. People respected results. I also began refining my strategy. This wasn't just about Karen anymore, it was about protecting my property in the long term. What other shortcuts might she try? Were there weak points in my defenses? How could I ensure that no one else could exploit my farm like this? These questions became my focus, and the pit was just the first line of defense. Late that evening, as the sun dipped behind the treeline, I realized something critical: controlling territory isn't about aggression. It's about intelligence, patience, and foresight. Karen had underestimated me. She had underestimated the ground beneath her, and that was a mistake she would never make again. Her retaliation was inevitable. But I was ready. It didn't take long for the HOA to catch wind of Karen's incident. Within 3 days, I had a formal letter slipped under my farmhouse door. It was stamped with the HOA seal and written in that officious, condescending tone they always used: "This is a matter of community concern." I chuckled before reading the rest. They demanded I remove unauthorized constructions and restore the terrain immediately or face fines. Fines. On my own property. The audacity was astonishing. I walked over to the pit location, now hidden seamlessly beneath the grass. Not a single trace remained. The earth had settled perfectly, and even the sharpest eye would miss it. The irony of being accused of unauthorized construction while the real construction was a lesson in boundaries wasn't lost on me. I could almost hear Karen's shrill voice behind the HOA letter: "You'll see. You can't outsmart the board." But the board wasn't omnipotent, they had rules, and my documentation was airtight. Still, I knew this wasn't just about paperwork. The HOA thrived on pressure, intimidation, and leveraging bureaucracy to enforce their will. Karen had simply manipulated their system for years. Now, she'd brought it to my doorstep, thinking sheer bureaucracy could erase consequences. But I was ready. I collected all the evidence: detailed photographs, measurements of the pit, timestamps, and even notes about her behavior leading up to the incident. Every point was factual, every detail provable. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA representatives, calm but firm. They arrived in polished SUVs, suits crisp, eyes trained to intimidate. Karen was there too, hair perfectly coiffed, wearing that smug expression she thought would sway the outcome. She didn't notice the faint smirk on my face as I laid out the facts. Photos, testimonies, timelines. I presented everything with quiet authority. No shouting, no theatrics, just undeniable evidence. The room grew tense. Karen's color drained as she realized that her usual tactics, bribery, charm, and manipulation, wouldn't work here. She could argue, scream, or threaten, but facts are stubborn things. The HOA representatives, initially impatient and condescending, shifted uncomfortably as they examined the materials. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind: respect the land, respect the rules, and respect yourself. Others will follow if you hold steady. By the end of the meeting, the HOA had no choice but to back down. No fines, no penalties, no mandated removal. Karen's wrath simmered silently, but I had made my point: my land was mine, and any trespass carried consequences. The pit had taught her a lesson: the documentation ensured the board couldn't undo it. Yet, even in victory, I knew the story wasn't finished. Karen doesn't give up. She plans. She watches. And the next time she underestimated me, it might not be a car at risk but something far more consequential. For a few days, the farm felt almost peaceful. The cows grazed calmly, the wind rustled through the trees, and the distant hum of traffic was merely background noise. But peace is fleeting when someone like Karen exists. I knew better than to believe that one lesson would permanently curb her audacity. People like her don't just apologize, they plot. And if she could survive humiliation, she could return with an even more elaborate scheme. Sure enough, one morning, a suspicious van appeared parked along the edge of my property, partially hidden by tall grass. At first, I thought it might be a delivery or a neighbor I hadn't seen yet. But the minute I stepped closer, binoculars in hand, I recognized Karen not alone, but with two companions from the HOA board. They were taking notes, measuring distances, snapping pictures. My blood pressure rose, but I stayed calm. The pit had taught me patience. I observed silently, cataloging every move. Every inch of my property she marked, every whispered conversation, every hurried glance. They were planning, scheming, hunting for an angle. I realized quickly that this wasn't just an act of petty retaliation, it was a reconnaissance mission. They were trying to find weaknesses in my defenses, trying to imagine a way to circumvent boundaries without confronting me directly. But they didn't account for one thing: I had anticipated this. My farm was a fortress of subtle traps, careful layouts, and natural deterrents. Not all were visible, some were psychological. Signs of surveillance, strategically placed obstacles, and my unflappable presence made every attempt at intrusion stressful. Karen finally noticed me. Her eyes widened in recognition, and a flash of irritation crossed her face. She waved, then turned sharply, whispering to her companions. Whatever plan they had was scrapped or at least delayed. She knew I had eyes everywhere, and she hated the uncertainty. For someone like her, control is everything. Not having it made her reckless. I realized that this was bigger than the pit, bigger than a single trespass. This was about establishing a boundary not just physically, but mentally. Karen and the HOA had to learn that my land wasn't just a patch of dirt, it was a statement. Every inch reinforced by careful planning, foresight, and the invisible message that any violation carried consequences. By evening, the van had disappeared. The field was quiet again. But I knew the silence was temporary. Karen's memory was long, and her resolve relentless. The game had shifted. She wouldn't stop testing me, but now, she had to proceed carefully, calculating every move with the knowledge that I had already thought 5 steps ahead. This was no longer a confrontation. It was a strategic war. And I was ready. Karen's reconnaissance visit had been subtle, but its implications were clear: she wasn't done. That evening, I started noticing other anomalies. Fresh tire tracks in areas that should have been untouched. Strange footprints near the barn. A drone hovering low over the pasture. It was obvious she was trying to map my property, test boundaries, and find a way around the invisible defenses I had set up. But the more I observed, the more I realized one thing: her impatience would be her weakness. I spent the next day reinforcing key areas, adjusting signs, and strategically placing subtle deterrents. Small, seemingly innocuous markers that would alert me if someone tried to pass certain points. The pit had been effective, but I didn't want to rely on one single method again. I needed redundancy layers of protection, each one designed to communicate the same message: trespassers are not welcome. By late afternoon, Karen returned, this time in a smaller SUV, driving slowly along the edge of my property. She stopped frequently, pretending to check her GPS, but her eyes darted everywhere, calculating, planning. I watched from the barn loft, binoculars in hand. Her expressions were priceless: frustration, curiosity, disbelief. Every glance revealed the same thought: how does he anticipate everything? She moved closer to the area where the pit had been. I felt a small thrill. She still remembered it, still feared it. But she wasn't deterred, she was testing limits. I reminded myself of something important: confrontation wasn't necessary right now. Observation was more powerful. Let her reveal her intentions while I remained in control. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Karen made a move toward an unmarked section of the pasture. I held my breath, ready to intervene if necessary. But instead of reckless acceleration, she hesitated, inspecting the ground carefully. Then, she backed off, muttering to herself. My traps didn't need to be active to be effective, the memory of consequences was enough to slow her down. This was the turning point. She realized that my farm was a puzzle she couldn't solve with arrogance or shortcuts. Her patience was fraying, her confidence shaken, and her plans faltering. I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, not just because I had defended my property, but because I had begun teaching a powerful lesson: respect is earned, not demanded. Night fell, and Karen disappeared once again. The field was calm, the fences intact, the traps concealed. But I knew one thing with certainty: the escalation had only just begun. She wouldn't give up, and neither would I. Weeks passed, and Karen's attempts grew bolder, more desperate. Her reconnaissance escalated from casual drives to late-night visits, probing my farm's boundaries under the cover of darkness. I knew she wanted one thing: to prove she could outsmart me. But I had anticipated every move, every strategy, every arrogance-fueled miscalculation. This wasn't just about protecting land anymore, it was about asserting control, teaching lessons, and proving that patience, intelligence, and foresight always win over recklessness and entitlement. One Friday evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I noticed headlights approaching from the far edge of the property. Karen's SUV, unmistakable even in the dim light. She wasn't alone. 2 HOA board members flanked her vehicle, their faces tense, expressions calculated. They drove slowly, almost cautiously this time, avoiding the areas they remembered from the pit. But I knew her ego. Pride wouldn't allow her to back down completely. I waited until they were deep enough into the field, far past the perimeter I had prepared. Then I triggered the final setup. Not a trap like the pit, this was subtler, a series of strategically placed obstacles that forced her SUV to navigate an almost invisible maze. Grass-covered depressions, hidden ridges, and carefully placed posts created confusion, forcing her to slow, second-guess, and hesitate. She cursed under her breath, her voice sharp and anxious. "Stop! This is ridiculous," she yelled at her companions. This isn't legal." I stepped out from behind the barn, hands empty, posture calm. She froze, realizing I was watching. The tension was electric, almost cinematic. The board members glanced nervously between me and Karen, clearly unsure what would happen next. I walked slowly toward them. "Karen," I said evenly, "you've been given every opportunity to respect boundaries. Yet here you are, trespassing again. You can turn around peacefully, or you can face the consequences you've been warned about." Her face twisted, frustration boiling over. "You think you've won? I'll make you regret this." "I think you already have," I replied. But it's your choice how to proceed. She hesitated, glancing at her companions. Slowly, reluctantly, she shifted the SUV into reverse. Her hands trembled. Pride battled fear, but the fear of consequences and the memory of the pit was stronger. The SUV backed carefully, retracing its path with extreme caution, and eventually, she exited my property, humiliated but unharmed. The field was silent once more, dust settling in the fading light. I watched them leave, feeling a surge of relief and satisfaction. The message had been delivered: boundaries exist. Trespassers pay attention. And some lessons, though harsh, must be learned the hard way. The aftermath was quiet, almost serene. Karen didn't return. The HOA kept their distance, likely realizing that my farm wasn't a place for petty disputes or bureaucratic intimidation. The pit, the hidden traps, the careful planning, they were more than just defenses. They were statements, lessons etched into the earth itself. I walked the fields in the early morning, the dew cool on my boots, the smell of soil and grass grounding me. The land was intact, the cows grazing peacefully, and the fences standing firm. Everything spoke of order restored. It was tempting to feel satisfaction in simple victory, but I understood a deeper truth: the story wasn't just about Karen. It was about respect, boundaries, and consequences. Every inch of this land, every trap, every sign, had become a reflection of those values. Karen had underestimated me, underestimated the farm, and underestimated the idea that consequences exist even when no one is watching. That mistake had cost her a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. Over time, neighbors began to take notice not of the drama, but of the results. The farm flourished. There was order where chaos once threatened. People spoke quietly about what had happened, admiration mingling with incredulity. Karen's name surfaced occasionally, whispered along fences and in conversation, but she no longer held power here. The ground had spoken, and it spoke clearly. I also realized something personal: standing your ground isn't about anger or revenge. It's about foresight, patience, and integrity. The pit was clever, yes, but it was only effective because it was just. Each measure I took was calculated, thought out, and meant to communicate a simple truth: respect what belongs to others, and respect yourself enough to enforce it. That principle extended far beyond this farm or any one neighbor. It became a standard for life. Weeks turned into months. The sun rose and set over the fields, the seasons changing like clockwork. Karen's brief, chaotic intrusion became a story told softly, almost like folklore, a cautionary tale about arrogance, entitlement, and the consequences of ignoring boundaries. And I realized something profound: my grandfather was right. The ground shifts for those who refuse to respect it. Now, standing at the edge of my property, I could see the entirety of the farm stretching under the golden sunlight. Every tree, every fence post, every blade of grass spoke of control, vigilance, and care. It was more than land, it was a statement, a legacy, a living lesson in patience and persistence. Karen had been a catalyst, but the lesson had been mine to give. As I turned to the barn, sipping coffee, I smiled faintly. The farm was mine. The boundaries were clear. And for anyone thinking of testing them, one thing was certain: the earth remembers.